seen from some of the research projects that CRUISSE has funded that actually CRUISSE has proved to be a pretty good glorified employment agency. It's very good at putting together a really interesting selection of clients and a group of very diverse, highly expert contractors together to produce good results. And that's great, and frankly, I think that's a tick as well. I think the interesting thing comes if we look at where more than that we can go. Have we produced enough evidence to say that this idea of trying to understand risk in radical uncertainty in box 3, that is an academic subject worthy of research, worthy of putting together an organisation to facilitate that work or not, is something completely beyond my skill set. But fortunately we have the two Davids and Lenny who will now be talking about it. If any of you wish to know who David or Lenny is, then I feel very sorry for you, but by now you should know. So can I just hand over to David the first?
Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you. I never thought of CRUISSE as a job creation scheme, but there you go. Anyway, I'm last up. And what we thought we should have at this point, and what I've been trying to do over the past couple of days, is think about where we've been over the past 2 years, and think about how that's been reflected and reported in what we've seen over these past 2 days. So what I'm going to do now is actually provide, if you like, a melange of 2 years and 2 days, all in one, hopefully with a narrative structure. And then you can see the difficulties of interdisciplinarity, because I will talk, and then these two will talk, and you'll see the problem. Okay? Now, let me just take you through. I begin with retrospect, and then move on to prospect, and then where I think we have to go from here to make the most of what we've got. But if you look back, this is really as Philip was saying just now. If we look back to where we started, there was this contention, let's call it a hypothesis, which we were involved in, that there is this class of decision making called involving radical uncertainty, that's really not really paid very much attention to in the literature. But if there was good academic research on it that did engage with what practitioners were doing, this would be of value. So that was contention, if you like, that was the hypothesis. And we've addressed it essentially in 2 ways. As David said yesterday morning, we've looked at what's in the literature. We've done some very simple bibliometric analyses. And when you do those, you realise that the way in which people support decision makers from the academic literature is focused around a very particular view of what decision making is. Largely neglected is what one would use to describe the conditions of radical uncertainty. There's this OCF dominance, as David put it. And then we started working with the practitioner community, because after all, there may be a very reasonable neglect.
What's OCF?
Optimal Choice Framework, sorry. It may be the case that neglect is actually well justified. It might be the case that one could go out there and engage with the practitioner community, and first off they might say, who are you? No, I don't need you. Or they might invite you in and then say, well, that was bloody useless. But in other words, we were testing the hypothesis that this could be a valuable thing to do by funding a whole variety of small projects. And looking at the ones I've seen over the course of the 2 years, but as the reports have gone to you over the past 2 days, I think the Research Council has got tremendous bang for their buck. I mean, the amount of really interesting, stimulating, thoughtful work, I think is really quite impressive, and I think I'm very grateful to all those who've been doing it. And really what that's pointed to is there's some significant, interesting problems out there that really could provide the substance for very interesting, important academic work that delivers very important value to the practitioner community. There's not a question of either side losing out by the engagement, practitioners becoming the grist for an academic mill, or the academics completely subordinating themselves to what's going on in the user community. The two go together in a very interesting way. So there are significant and interesting problems out there. If you're thinking about it from a research council point of view, we've supported the hypothesis. It clearly is the case this is worth looking at. And what's more, it gives the opportunity for very interesting research to be done. In all sorts of senses, as Philip was saying, tick those boxes. But also as we've been doing it, and again it's the thing that was said yesterday, we've discovered a variety of things that matter for why we are in the position we're in now, and some of the things that will need to be done if CRUISSE is to take its agenda forward. It's going to have some sense of purpose and mission following this piece of work. What's that going to look like? What's it got to address? What are the key things to be concerned with? Now, there's all sorts of things which a number of you will know about through personal experience, or if you're much younger, will have heard about from older ones like me, about how universities have changed over the last 30 to 40 years. In particular, the way in which we've slipped into disciplinary silos. You see it right across institutions. There's a multiplicity of reasons behind it. Apart from some of the honourable exceptions, and I think the work we saw by Ben and Laura this morning is a classic example of not falling for this trap. But often we see it to be worse in the social sciences. I spent most of my career in the social science faculty, and it's amazing how social science faculties became ever more concerned to make clear that they were particularly this kind of sociology or this kind of psychology. And that really has been very unhelpful to the kind of agenda that we've been developing. So disciplinary silos, not peculiar to the social sciences, but you see them there more, are really problematic. And there's a very interesting article a few years ago, I can send anybody a copy of it if they wish, about the ways in which the social sciences are interesting, because you go back over the past century, their names have hardly changed at all. Go back over the past century and look at the natural science disciplines, you find their names have changed a lot. They've actually moved on, they've progressed. The truisms that set them up many years ago are no longer applicable now. And those institutional silos have become reinforced by many factors to do with funding, many factors to do with the way in which administration, audit, accounting and control have put in place. Academics have very much less freedom now to make choices about what they do compared to when I started my career in the 80s. So those things are very important. It's not just that the disciplines themselves have become hunkered down because they are timid and weak-minded or something. Every sort of pressure pushes to that kind of outcome. Now, some of that might have been changed quite a bit by things like the impact agenda associated with the Research Excellence Framework, but as Lenny pointed out yesterday, it's tidbits. You get rewarded in a rather peculiar way making a claim about a paper leading to something out there. It's not really considering value in a greater sense. I mean, the whole idea is impact. In various ways, it sort of misunderstands the value of a two-way flow between the academy and the wider world, which I think is really the beneficial aspect of what we've been seeing with our projects. A couple other points here which I think are rather important following on from that. Just one, those who've heard me talk about these things before would recognise some of the things up here. But of course, one of the things that when people get obsessed with ideas, the academy has to choose what it does. That's the way in which good academic progress happens. And that's certainly true for lots of research areas. I won't want to deny the value of that. But the disciplinary dynamic, where what you know now highlights the problems you then go on to work on, is only one trajectory that brings to the fore important and interesting academic problems. That disciplinary dynamic is presumptive of the fact that there isn't going to be something in what Donald Stokes called Pasteur's quadrant. Stokes' book, which has that name, I'd recommend it to you if you've not seen it. In that book, he said if you look at science policy, it's ignored the fact that you can have considerations of use or considerations for theory as a way in which you think about research, but that's a 2x2 table. And the cell, which is work done for considerations of use and considerations of theory, can be extremely beneficial. and that you often source those activities in the external world. He called it Pasteur's quadrant because Pasteur was his poster child for that quadrant. Louis Pasteur's work on the French wine industry, from which we all benefit from much less spoilage and such like, made a major contribution to the development of microbiology. So he solved the problem and he contributed to the academy. The kind of things we've been hearing about from the pilot projects, all of them have that characteristic within them, not fully cashed out yet, but clearly a possibility within them. And if you look back on the history of science, particularly in the UK, there's another book for you to read. You can time an academic, can't you? I'm giving you a reading list already, it's terrible. But if you've not read it, Jenny Uglow's book, The Lunar Men, this is about the Industrial Revolution in Britain, where nobody cared about whether it was science or arts or industry. They're all people who were working together around things which interested them. They didn't see these divides. They saw interest and pursuit of knowledge, pursuit of cash. You know, they weren't shy about that, but the things came together. If you look at the way in which the disciplines were set up, they actually have their foundation in that to a large extent. Other foundations too, of course. And the other thing I want to bring up and just highlight now, because it seems to come through as a repeated theme over the past couple of days, is how we think about models. And looking back over the work of CRUISSE and some of the other things I've been involved in recently, there's this tendency, and the optimal choice framework issue illustrates it very well, that people get obsessed with their particular model. As Lenny said, you know, they get into model land, and it's great fun. I mean, why would you get off these funfair rides? It's great fun there. Well, you see it all over. I mean, you see it in terms of model land as Lenny described it. You see it in my discipline of experimental psychology. People get the phenomena into the lab, and they decide what they've got in the lab, and the statistical model by which they analyse it is the phenomenon. Then all that happens is people keep doing the next possible experiment. They fail to go back to the phenomenon. So these dynamics are very strong. And that can lead to the conclusion that maybe we shouldn't be thinking about models to pass across to practitioners. But notice yesterday there was one point when it came to a head, and it's when we had the start presentations. One of our colleagues there, probably a Sarah, because that seems to be the best guess, Sarah said, well, they came forward with that, and that wasn't particularly useful. And the simple thought there is, models are valuable as cognitive prosthetics. They help your thinking. They enable you to explore an idea without actually having to have it all in your head at one go. And it came up when we were talking about cost-benefit analysis, and that's the point that Richard made. Let's think about the ways in which we can use these models in a flexible and creative way. And let's get models that suit the purpose. There's the work that Lenny and Erica did with the Pakistan project. A model that suits the purpose of the person trying to make the decision then. Models are great, to be perfectly honest. Those cognitive prosthetics really help. That leads you to ask the question, for whom and for what purpose? For some reason, when I was putting these slides together early on, I thought this might be an interesting one to put up. I now think it's a bit silly, but I'll just explain it so you don't go away mystified. I presume that most of you know this one. Noughts and crosses. Tic-tac-toe if you're American. Noughts and crosses. Okay? The one on the left, that's number Scrabble. Children find the one on the left quite hard to play. What you do in number Scrabble, you take turns in taking a tile. So if I take a 9 from one side, my opponent can take a 5 from the other side. I can't then take a 5 because it's missing its partner. And you go through, and the game is to actually get 3 tiles in your set in front of you that add up to 15. That is the identical game to noughts and crosses. It's completely isomorphic. But the representation of one allows you to do it very much better than the other. And it's proven by the fact of the magic square in the middle. Every 3-number combination that gives you 15 is a row or a line or a diagonal in the magic square, which is tic-tac-toe. So I put that in because I'm a psychologist. I'm interested in the ways in which representations work for people. But the essential point is representations for a purpose, for a user. And I think the academic research can really be deployed to do that very effectively and very interestingly. Oh yes, and I just thought, well, useful models, I mean, if you remember that models are models, like an orrery is an orrery, it's not the solar system. And importantly, if you try and get into the game of making your models perfect, those who were at the Treasury a few weeks ago have seen me put this one up then. If you like Lewis Carroll, you may know, but you may not know, this last work of his, Sylvie and Bruno. And the story of Sylvie and Bruno is about how this visitor to this other country has told them about maps. And so, what's a map? Well, it's a representation of the country. Oh, what makes for a good map? Well, we've got this 6 miles to an inch here one. Well, we could make it more detailed. And when the visitor goes back at a later point, he asks them how they got on with maps. They said, oh, you thought 6 miles to an inch was good. Well, we ended up with 1 inch to an inch. It's the best map you could possibly imagine. And so the visitor asked, well, are you using it? He said, no, the farmers complained it cut out all the light for their crops. So we had to fold it up and put it away. So in other words, the key point is its representations, its models that are cognitive prosthetics. They help you do something. And the kind of engagement we've been in is actually developing ways in which you can help people do their decision making. That's the crucial bit in these difficult circumstances. And also, the one other thing I was going to put in was, and again it struck me as a thing that kept coming through. I like this one, it was a wonderful radio program on Radio 4, probably one of the best things that Michael Portillo has ever done, things we forgot to remember. Historical events that somehow got lost to the culture. And of course, all the things we've been talking about, many years ago, people did actually take seriously. They didn't have the resources and tools and techniques we've got available now to do the class of exercise, but nevertheless they were barking up the same tree. And these two I think are very interesting. If you don't know them, I'd recommend them. This is, on the left, there's Explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, which Allison and Zellico did, where they looked at the different models for understanding how decision-making was done. There's a rational actor theory, there's the organisational structure theory, and there's bureaucratic politics theory. You analyse it in different ways, and you get a very different account of how decision-making goes. This was a nice article written in 1959 in Science of Muddling Through as a riposte to operations research. In that post-war period, OR took over very strongly, and people thought that's the way to go. It certainly helped a large number of companies do a very good job. And then Bloom pointed out that if you looked at the ways in which that operates, many organisations that have been around for a very long time have never done that. They've actually been, I mean, if it was the Science of Muddling Through, you would never put that article title out now. It'd make you look like a fool. But you say, the power of agile management, or something like that. So, in other words, there's a whole series of things we've seen over the long run of the CRUISSE project so far, in the last couple of days, which I think are really worth bearing in mind, we need to capture as we report back. That then leaves us, and if you've not had a decent political education, you won't understand the title of this slide, and I'll tell you at the end. Anybody recognise it? At least one person does. Two do? Yeah, you would do, wouldn't you, Tobias? What is to be done? Well, we've been talking about this and thinking about it. We've been drafting a paper that addresses this question. And there are these things that we need to do. If we're to follow through on what CRUISSE has demonstrated, we need to be, first of all, be in the business of mobilising diverse expertise from across the academy. It's very clear you've got to bring in a whole variety of different mentalities, perspectives, disciplines, theories, approaches to actually be helpful in the way we've been trying to be helpful. Secondly, you've got to think about this in terms of the value chain which connects the university to the wider world. You can't simply do some wonderful stuff and stick it out there and hope somebody takes it away. It's like those sad baskets of apples you see outside people's gates with apples or courgettes or whatever. They've got a huge number in their garden, they can't be asked to actually have them all. So they put them outside and say, help yourself. And about 3 weeks later you see the same basket with a series of mouldering apples or courgettes in it. I mean, that's much of what goes on with the distribution of academic research to the rest of the world. Let's not be the basket of apples by the front gate. Let's be like a proper organisation that thinks about the value chain, that ensures that what we do gets delivered to those who would want it and value it. And that involves not just the academic piece, as I'll show in a moment. The second important piece in this, because of both these kinds of interaction, what's absolutely crucial is that you co-create, co-construct the agenda. It wasn't until I saw David's slides that I realised I've been saying co-construction, which is a term I use elsewhere, and he was using co-creation. We mean the same thing. In other words, you're in an engagement with people to understand what's going on. You have to do this stuff, as we've seen, in a timely way. There's no point in doing it in a timeless way if you're trying to help somebody make a choice now. And if we're going to do these things, we're really going to be in the business of serious institutional and cultural change. This, if we can pull this agenda together and deliver it, it will be very disruptive for many people. And we should recognise that, and recognise that really we're in the business of cultural change at a very important time. And for that reason, you will see in your programme, what we're thinking of is we should have some kind of institute that does this. And I'll come at the end to the reasons why we should have such an institute. But let me expand on these different elements just a little bit for you. I mean, if you think about it, we have diverse expertise in the academy. And by that we mean the kind of great array of disciplines one normally sees. But what one would want to do is not actually mobilise them as their disciplines alone. Many years ago I was involved in a consultation for another programme I was in, and Philip, I can't remember his name now, but Philip may know the person. It was the head of university relations for BP. And this was in the early the early part of the last decade. And he got very fed up with the way the discussion was going, because it was quite a lot of pointy heads talking about the pointy head agenda. He said, look, it's simple. I have problems, you have departments. I turn up with a problem, you send me off to a particular department. They can't answer my problem, so why do I go there? I need people from all over the place. And so although we've got to have people who know about something, we've got to have that domain-specific knowledge. We can't have people that are just generalists all the time. We've got to be able to bring them together. And in bringing them together, we should look at a whole variety of methods and techniques they can bring to fresh problems. These are not just their disciplinary norms. So capacities to build models and do simulations, to do various kinds of design work. Design practice, I think, will actually figure large in the way we're thinking about things. To do experimentation, to understand how you do observational, narrative and ethnographic work, to properly understand that rich texture of meaning which actually organises social arrangements. Unless we get a grip on that, we're going to be stuffed. And finally, we've got questions of organisational design and practice. If you're going to do these things properly, you're going to change how the world is run. And when you look at that value chain, we have the theoretical community, the academy as such, but also you've got the decision makers at the other end. There are various people who sit in these interstitial positions that play a very important role. And fostering people to sit in those positions, I think, will be very important. You have people who can draw together the theoretical community in the appropriate way. If you look in the commercial sector, you go to places like, there's a large number of these companies in the Cambridge area, companies like Cambridge Consultants. They have this term which, bless you, which upsets some people, but the guys who do it don't get upset because they get a very large paycheck. Sales engineers. What does a sales engineer do? He goes out and works with the client and understands, and by the way, it's almost always a he, unfortunately, there you go. Goes out and works with the client and figures out what back office expertise Cambridge Consultants has that can be brought together and mobilised to actually address that company's particular problems. And so you've got somebody who sits in that position between the theoretical community and the knowledge brokers that then connects you through to the decision makers. Unless we start properly understanding that value chain in this area we're trying to work in, we'll start finding things don't work too well. There'll be pinch points in the connections that we won't probably won't realise why they're there. We might think we're failing if we don't properly understand those matters. On the co-creation and co-construction thing, I think this is absolutely vital to what we're on about. Apart from bringing these diversities together, co-creation and co-construction has to be at the heart of it. If we lose sight of this, we lose sight of really what we're on about. I mean, in various ways, this came up in a number of talks. You have to think about what, in my world, because I work a lot on design practices with colleagues, you have to think about end-user requirements. You have to think about user specification. There's a number of ways you can do that. And I think we've seen with a number of the projects, our colleagues who've been doing the projects have been very sensitive to this thought. But it has to be a dialogue. You have to avoid, if you've not heard it before, you have to avoid the faster horse problem. Because when you come into this conversation from one side, i.e. the academic side, you wouldn't expect the other side to know everything that's possible given what the research literature says. You might be able to ask them what they would like as users, but they don't know what the world of possibility is. It's called the faster horse problem. It's attributed to Henry Ford. I don't know if that's actually true. But he was asked, why didn't you ask people what they wanted before you sort of invented or developed the motor car? He said, well, if I'd asked them, they would ask for a faster horse. The motor car is a better solution to their problem of going faster. So if you don't actually engage in these dialogues, you end up with suboptimal outcomes. It's got to be a two-way street. But, and this is a really big and important but, those conversations are not easy. Getting the skill and capacity to facilitate those conversations requires a huge amount of expertise and experience over time. There are practices we know about and we can use, often coming from the design literature. If you go to the various design practices that we see in a whole number of different areas, you can see ways through practices like interaction design, agile design, adaptive practice. We have different ways of engaging your end user to actually develop an understanding of what it is that they would benefit from. If you look at the ways in which a number of projects have gone, I could actually write you a story, but most of them into the context of agile design. A constant interaction between the two, thinking about how you make the most of what the user wants to achieve in the light of what they now know that you can do for them. And ultimately what we should be looking at is supporting decision makers by delivering useful insight, accounts, models and narratives that help them. And when we're doing that, and if you're sitting in the academic side of this story, the other thing you should be looking at is, how do I feed this back to the academic literature? How do I then draw a generic lesson from this? How do I satisfy that demand of Pasteur's quadrant? Considerations of use, considerations of theory. If we're thinking about why the research councils would want to fund this, sitting in that quadrant is absolutely essential. And they can see the values of the academy, the values of the wider world. Timeliness. This often comes up when one works with people in a practitioner sector. I've seen it a lot myself working with a variety of companies, and certainly to a certain extent with policymakers. Policymakers in the sense, you have a phone call late one afternoon, my minister's giving a speech on this tomorrow. I haven't a clue. What would you say? At least what can you stop them saying that would make them look stupid? Those sorts of considerations. And if we're going to take this agenda seriously, we've got to be sensitive to that timeliness issue. If we're only ever going to do the things where we can do them over a long period of time and feel totally comfortable about it, we can carry on as we are, to be perfectly honest. We want to be able to respond in a timely fashion. Sometimes that's the phone goes, you have to answer it, you have to talk now, that's it. Maybe you've got a day or so. If you're lucky, you've got 3 days. But some of these demands come through very quickly. And what they rely upon is having access to a network of experts, people who are willing to actually drop other things and actually come to the phone, join a Skype call, actually be there and talk it through, and be guiding that talking through by people who've got the expertise to enable that interaction. The interesting thing about if you start doing that, and I've seen this myself in a number of things I've done, you actually do that and you think, blimey, I hope I didn't put my foot in. I hope I was okay on that. So what you then do is you get into the literature, or maybe get a postdoc or a graduate student into the literature to find out what's out there. And you pull out all the papers, and you write up the story of what's in the literature, and hopefully you breathe a sigh of relief. But what you've done at that point is you've taken what you thought was your understanding and consolidated it and supported it by what's in the literature. Now, interestingly, my experience when you do that kind of thing, so you then actually identify an important gap in our current understanding that would matter for the question that's been asked. And that goes you through the sequence I've got up there, an immediate response, an intermediate response, and then a considered response, where from the first two, you're seeing this as part of the co-construction agenda. You're actually developing an understanding of what would be needed, because you've got this immediate demand, because that's what matters. You then build that over time, and you say, well, look, we've got a very interesting novel academic question here. Let's try and get some money to actually deliver on this. And you can, of course, as you're doing this, keep up your engagement with the person you are working with. And as you do this, then you develop the agenda. I've seen this in working with a variety of companies and government departments. You build a sense of trust. They value you. You get to understand what they're on about. And so you suddenly start building a community of people who've got this as their mental set. Not one of my colleagues in my particular subject wanting to do. What is it that these people out there in the world want to do? Oh, and by the way, I can deliver it back to my colleagues in my department as one of the wonderful impact case studies that will get them a high mark in the ref. So it really does work, but it's going to be very disruptive in certain circumstances. So timing this really matters. In all of this, as I mentioned earlier, CRUISSE, if it carries on down this pathway, one has to recognise it's going to be disruptor. Going to have to develop a different cultural form in the academy. It's going to have to help policymakers and decision makers understand how it can be useful, moving us into a novel place. And that may in turn have an impact in the wider society. I mean, it's come up from time to time over the past couple of days, but the ways in which the constraints which operate for the decision makers, particularly if they're civil servants supporting a minister, is the way in which the minister operates in a political space that configures what might be useful for that civil servant. But of course, if you start shifting the ways in which they're supporting their minister, over time, hopefully, you might shift the political narrative. It'll take a long time, probably 50 years or so. But these are long games, okay? You think about what got us to this point, it was a long game. You can probably date it back to Robbins in '63.
Yeah.
That's the long game that's hit us right now in terms of the academy. For politics, it's probably even much longer. Come to it in the discussion. But we're going to be changing institutions. We're going to need to think about changing funding arrangements. Too much of what the research councils do is fire and forget funding. You work up your proposal, you do all the hard work, and maybe 1 in 3, if you're lucky, you get it. Dropping down to 1 in 100, I gather, for ERC grants now. After March 29th, none in 100 probably, but the joy of Brexit. Think about the funding rates. Think about how actually you can engage with the funding. I mean, the funding we put forward for these small projects, very small amounts, great delivery. Now, actually, if we could say, oh, well, out of this has come these really interesting questions, let's give some more money to it. It's very different to the way in which we think about funding now. We almost might think of it as rather open-minded, guided funding in quite interesting ways. And through that, developing some of the cultural narratives. I mean, we've heard a lot about how people got this horror of the audit culture, the way in which you've got this culture of blame when things don't work out when you make a decision. There's an institutional and cultural change, I would argue, and you could develop this a lot more. I realised when I looked through my pad, I've written down loads of things over the past 2 days about cultural changes that might follow if we get this right. It's a lot longer than those two, but I thought I'd put those two down. So the final stage of what is to be done. Well, supposing we had a UK institute. Well, what we've been effectively doing, both some of us centrally, but everybody in the network collectively. I mean, this is a thing that's really benefited from so many people joining in, supporting, helping, enabling. But it's a series of people who are committed to this cause, who actually have put time, energy and effort into it, and have actually exerted leadership. You don't need to have simple-minded leadership to make things led. It's been leadership in a way that if this were to be an institute, we would be in the business of developing people. Think about the younger generations coming through would take this agenda on. As you can see from my grey hair, it's not going to be my agenda very soon. Taking that agenda on, they need to be supported in developing careers of this, like this. It's most importantly, and this is probably one of the most important reasons for having an institute, this is a human social practice. This is a body contact sport. This is not something you do by leaving a residue of materials on some web server somewhere. As observed earlier today, you go back to the 1990s, people everybody thought we could deal with expertise by developing answer gardens, I think was the term then. I even got involved in creating some of them. You've got this answer garden, wonderful place you walk into, it's a bit like Lenny's model land. You walk in there, as you walk around, there's bound to be some wonderful tree with a fruit on it that serves your purpose. And you will eat it, and that will be wonderful. So what you've got to do is build the garden, the answer garden, and you get rid of all the experts. Turns out, for all the instances where people tried this, the most important thing to do was to keep the experts available to guide you through the answer garden. In other words, these are very human social practices, and to ignore that is a big mistake. You also need an institute. If you want to make this expertise available, you've actually got to have a point where people can connect to. There's got to be a front door. People criticise my university, and I can see how it worked down here at UCL as well. They say, hey, come to Cambridge University, they can't bloody well find it. But where's the front door? That's not what a university is in some respects. People then say, oh, well, I talked to somebody at your university, they're doing this really fascinating thing on this and this and this and this. You say, really? I didn't have a clue. In other words, universities in that sense aren't coherent, coordinated entities. What you need is a point of contact. This brings up the model of Cambridge consultants I mentioned before. Can you have something like the sales engineer as well, that can make those connections and make the expertise available in a timely way? This institute could also be the repository for the learning that's gone on elsewhere. One of the things we've heard from the different projects is, again, the start one yesterday was a good example of the start one in the morning, where they actually learned something, but they're not going to be in the business. They've got neither the time nor the money to pass it on to other people. But suppose you've got a place like this that could actually basically harvest the good learnings from all over and make them available to others. And perhaps even make them to others through short courses, master's programs, that kind of educational agenda. Something you might want to develop as you build this over time. If we do all of this, then one of the things we should really take seriously is if we are being a radical disruptor, if we are creating a new model, we should also study the model that we have created. If we don't understand the model and aren't able to pass it on, we would have seriously missed a trick. Last 2 points. I've done a lot of work with people in startups and I've worked with entrepreneurs over the years. And one of the things that marks out successful entrepreneurs in all sorts of ways is persistence. People go about all sorts of characteristics and so forth. Appropriate persistence is the thing that makes a startup work. When everybody else has given up, you've still got that twinkle in the eye. You're going to get that premium that I think Mark was talking about yesterday, from being the entrepreneur who actually understands the risk and manages it when other people have given up. Then you get the reward. But it really is quite tough. It requires persistence. And finally, and I think this really is a very important thing for us right now, I think actually through what CRUISSE has done over the past couple of years, we've developed a very interesting momentum. We've really got some very interesting things going on. David told me today that we've got a no-cost extension. One might call it a no-cost, no-money extension, since there's very little left in the kitty. But we've really got to start thinking hard and acting quick to make the most of the momentum we've got, so that people can keep coming together and start carrying on. Now that's my view of what I've heard over the past 2 years and the past 2 days. The two who started the past 2 days are now going to say, what are you all about? Anyway, there we go. Philip, over to you.
Thank you very much, David.
But I'd just like, after all this talk about radical uncertainty and all the rest, I'd just like to go back to basics, a number of things. So, first of all, the reason that we want to insist on the differentiation between radical uncertainty and risk, or whatever we want to call it, is simply because we want to stress that there are these situations where you simply don't know whether the data you have is relevant to the future problem you're trying to solve. And if you look at the original list of problems I put up on the board, so to speak, on this here at the beginning, those were problems that we were given more or less by the Research Council. So those were the ones that they were interested in, and every single one of those are these complicated problems. However, having said that, the next interesting thing really is what we call the optimal choice framework. That there's nothing in itself, well, it can be in some situations, but we need the optimal choice framework. It can be extremely valuable, but we also want to see first that this dominates, this has taken over what it means to be decision making. Now, if you think about that psychologically, I don't usually bring my psychology into all this, but it's a bit odd. It means that we've basically got this idea of finding omnipotent solutions. And this goes into society, where politicians are apparently terrified of actually saying, well, we've made this decision. I mean, a good one was given earlier about the Treasury opinion about Brexit. In fact, if they'd explained, well, we've had a look at 3 things we think are likely to happen about Brexit. One is that we think it'll cause a fall in sterling, and this is why. Another is this, another is this. And we don't really know the exact costs of each one of these, but all 3 of these processes look likely to happen. Now, I don't know if that's the right way, but you can, if you actually give some explanation, you put it inside a sensible narrative, people will listen to it. If you say, oh, we've got a model which produces £437 per family per month or something, people just think, what the hell are you talking about? Because they know it can't be true. They simply know it. And so this issue of the optimal choice framework, I think, is very problematic. But it's not that we shouldn't do it. It's just that that in the disciplines that should have been looking at decision making, have not really been doing so because they've got themselves seduced into the optimal choice framework, whether it's economics or psychology. And then in the disciplines that are producing these optimal choice frameworks, they are, as it were, producing these apples to put outside the house, which are not necessarily useful when it comes to people actually taking them up. And this is what has led, one of our findings is that decision makers actually don't know what is available in the maths area, if I can put it as simply. It's not just a question that they want the radical uncertainty and all that. They don't actually know how to use the maths. So if you take Miles's interesting work earlier today, the idea in cybersecurity that people think some of the problems are radically uncertain when actually they're not particularly, that's a very important and so that is why the triage is fundamentally important. Now, I'd just like to say something about co-creation, because I'm absolutely convinced that co-creation will produce better science. Because when we went down to Swindon, they were worried we just turn into management consultants or something. But I'm convinced that working on real-life problems, and especially people from several disciplines working on a real-life problem, that will produce better science because it's more challenging, it forces you to be creative, it forces you to understand things, and it's just, it's certainly worth trying. So we've currently, narrowed it down in the document to 10 question or 10 problem areas that I put up on the board. Things like narratives, emotions, and so on at the beginning. And those 10 questions themselves, each one of them would produce a wealth of scientific knowledge and advance, I believe, and ones that many people are calling from at the moment. Yeah. So just going back to the pilot projects, I've mentioned Ben's. I think we've seen Tobias's with the start people. There's Miles with the thing. But there's also Chris DeMeyer at the back, though. This is the one where they're making this experiential way of trying to find out about what advice should we give, etc., if there's a power outage. Now, I think you noticed, but in fact, I think that could not only be a useful way of thinking about the particular problem he's got, but also could actually bring in a really new way of new methodology for psychology. Psychology's a little bit stuck with its methods. They have the validation crisis. They've never really completely faced up to the question of out of experiment validity. And this could be certainly a very interesting way of looking at problems that are very real, which people have not. So that's just one example of what I see as science coming from this, as well as useful relevance for the decision makers. Okay, so I think the only other real point I wanted to make is about that a lot of these things, once you start looking at decisions and the way they are, you run into sort of the kinds of problems like defensiveness, like blame culture, but we also run more generally into what I call the problem of divided states, which is people doing things and deciding things which they actually know are suboptimal. So we had Gert Gigerenzer come and visit us early last year, and he described a survey he'd done of leading German businessmen, and 60% of senior decision makers in German business said that were it not for the issue of the culture of their organization and the potential for being blamed, etc., they'd have made a different decision. So the decision making at the moment is far from optimal. But the reason it's far from optimal has to do with social and psychological processes that we don't need to give up on. We need to understand them. And it's the same thing with uncertainty. We're not arguing that for uncertainty that you can't do anything. We're arguing that because of uncertainty, actually what people do is create a state of certainty in their minds when that certainty is not actually the certainty they should be having. Now, you need a degree of certainty. You need it to take an action. You need to, what I call, have a conviction narrative. But the way in which you develop that conviction narrative is important, and that's really why I thought from this morning's, both the Ben's talk and Miles's talk, one of the most important things that needs to come into people's decision making is to build in getting feedback on your decisions. So regulation, for example, it's no good making the regulation and then hoping it'll work. You've got to keep looking at it. And I also believe that will make people more interested in what they're doing, because, if you actually look at the effects of what you're doing, you then can learn from it and so on. So these are a few remarks that I wanted to make, and our intention is to go forward. The document that we have done for the Research Council is a 10-page document on which my talk was based. If any of you would like it, you can email me. What we'd really like is criticism of it, additions to it, references. At the moment, it's a pretty solid document, but it could certainly be a lot better with all of your input. Thank you very much.
In my view, this has probably been one of the most interesting grant proposals I've ever worked on. And part of that was being co-I, which was great. I could hide behind David. But the rest was just the things that we did. And the things that we, all of CRUISSE, not LSE, not just Erica. And this, it was just, they were all interesting. I mean, usually in this kind of group thing, year 2 or 3, hopefully yours, that you think are really cool. But every single project was interesting. And I think what we have is a new path, in a way. We sort of blazed this new path, and it's been very exciting, and we've been very successful. I mean, I'm surprised how successful we are. So for me, the questions are, can we keep not only the momentum, but also the people? I mean, this phrase, army of Ericas, you know, I don't want an army of Ericas. Actually, one is quite a handful. But I like a platoon, right? A number of people, David sometimes calls them fellows, who can go out and survey more of this land. I think the co-creation truly is key. I've sort of done this by accident a lot of my career because I always, you know, I felt being a physicist at the LSE that one of the things it helped us do was I thought we were sort of bringing economics into the real world by really showing the value of weather in economics, right, in real world decision making. But really, I think it also brings all of me as a modeler back to reality, right? It forces me to actually do better science. So I strongly support this comment, which I hadn't heard before. And to grope with empirical realities. And I think that would be good for science, for both science and social science as a whole, and it really leaves us with true applications. I think the co-communication has also been interesting. The plays, the various ways of interacting and communicating, these were much richer than I thought. And so, you know, what's next? Well, what I would like to know is how do we, first of all, continue illustrating, right? We've illustrated a number of case studies that, like with START, these are moving on in that particular pipe to do more of the same. You know, can we keep building these kinds? They're ludicrously inexpensive. They have huge buy-in. I don't think we have to wait. If you look at the tweet stream for this meeting, there are quite a few people who asked to be invited to next year's. Not all in the UK. And so, you know, for me, with a platoon of Ericas or with Erica, if we can keep showing how this approach actually works in a way that it solves box 3 problems other approaches just can't reach. To say nothing negative about the problems we solve in more traditional ways. And my other question is, well, how much is enough? Right? I mean, how many times do we have to find a nice application for, suppose we do heat waves, droughts, agricultural crisis, large numbers of people on the move, and then we take each project and illustrate more places where this way of thinking actually leads to more informed, more comfortable decision making, and sometimes better outcomes. How many do we have to do before it becomes reasonable to think, hey, we should really invest in this larger strategy, this complementary strategy, and try to put the UK as a leader in actually, you know, fanning this out globally?
Thank you, Lenny.